Hey Bio 2 students, Professor Carafit here. Today we are going to begin the lecture on chapter 29 and 33. As a word of warning, some of my pictures come from a different edition of the book, so the figure numbers that sometimes appear on the slides won't match your chapters, but our book is chapters 29 and 33. So animal and plant physiology is kind of what we're talking about here, what we're beginning here. We already talked about the endocrine system, and because of time constraints, I did not include plant hormones in that lecture, but we will talk about some plant stuff in this chapter and work our way through animal digestion and other things. So just to, let's look at this from an animal perspective first. If we look at a cladogram of the kingdom Animalia, so these are multicellular eukaryotes that have muscles and active movement. We probably evolved from a conoflagellate ancestor. That's the outgroup, and the first real animal here that's multicellular are sponges, and you can see all these different kinds of animals here. Okay, now there's two major kinds of digestive tracts in the animals that have tissues. That's everyone after the sponges. The first kind is called a gastrovascular cavity. And a gastrovascular cavity is when you have an opening to the outside world and food comes in, and it's not really an organ in there so much as just an opening with like seawater in it or pond water, and then you secrete acid into that opening, digest food, and absorb the nutrients. And then the same opening that you brought food in is also how you get rid of waste. So the mouth and anus are the same opening. That's called a gastrovascular cavity, and we see that mostly in the cnidarians and the flatworms are the two that we'll mention throughout the semester. The cnidarians, which are like hydra, which is something that lives in the lakes and streams around here, as well as jellyfish. And then platyhelminthes are flatworms that we'll talk about as we go through the semester. So that's an alimentary canal, whereas a lot of these other animals up here have what we call an alimentary canal. An alimentary canal, also known as a complete digestive tract, has a mouth and an anus, and it's one tube that runs through the length of the body, and food gets digested and processed and absorbed along the way. Now, why are we eating this food? Why are we digesting it? Well, if we go back to Bio 1 stuff, we're using it for the macromolecules to build our cells, to build our organelles, things like that. We're also using the energy in our food to run through cellular respiration and make ATP. So we bring in food, lots of energy in that food, and a whole lot of it is lost as heat along the way. This is where some of our internal body heat comes from, is all this heat we're wasting as we digest food and then as we process it through cellular respiration and do cellular work. So that stuff we talked about in Bio 1 is relevant here. All of that electron transport chain and all of that stuff ties back to the food you eat. So if we look at alimentary canals, we're going to focus on the vertebrate digestive system here. It's an opening with a mouth at one end and then an anus at the other, and all the different organelles in between. And we see this in lots of different kinds of animals. So it's also known as a complete digestive tract, so mouth, anus, and everything in between. So we have this tube, and parts of that tube are specialized for different jobs, different tasks. Okay, now I'm not going to go over all these in detail on this slide, but here are some of the major digestive systems here. So the mouth and pharynx, that's the entry point. The pharynx is kind of the beginning of the throat. Esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then the rectum or cloaca. A cloaca is a common exit point for solid and liquid wastes and reproduction that we see in birds sometimes. So these are the major organs. These are not all the organs because there are also accessory organs. So the gastrovascular cavity includes the organs that food actually travels through. And then there are accessory organs that are plumbed into that system that secrete digestive enzymes into that system to help break down food. So if we look at the schematic diagram on the right, we can see kind of what this would look like if it were made out of glassware in the lab. You have the mouth, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus, and it's just one big tube. It's modified in different ways, but it's one big tube. And then these, the gallbladder, liver, salivary glands, these are all accessory glands, or accessory organs that pump stuff into the digestive system, allowing for digestion to take place. And then here's an actual diagram of a human's digestive system. I want to point out that, so here's the pharynx is kind of the base of the throat here. That's a word we don't use that often, so just so you know, it's like the opening of the throat, the beginning of the esophagus, kind of where the mouth and esophagus interface there. And the word sphincter. Sphincters are valves that open and shut, allowing things in or out. They're like a valve, so they open up to let food into the stomach. They open up to let food out of the stomach, for example. So we'll come back to diagrams like this later on. Okay, so step 1 of digestion is called mastication. Mastication, that's when you chew up your food. So if we're going to ingest food, so all the animals we're talking about ingest food, most organisms that are animals or protists that are animal-like ingest food. Some secrete digestive enzymes and absorb it like fungi, but we're talking about ingesting. So we bring it into the body. Okay, so first step is we bring it into the body and we chew it and we mix it with saliva. And chewing increases the surface area of the food, making it easier to get chemicals to it, to digest it. And saliva then lubricates the food, making it easier to swallow. Saliva also contains an enzyme called amylase. Whenever you see that ase ending, it typically refers to an enzyme. And amylase is an enzyme that breaks down amylose, which is starch. And if you recall, starch is a polysaccharide, a great big long chain of glucose molecules. So amylase breaks that down into smaller parts. Now, in the mammals like we see down below, there's lots of different kinds of teeth that have evolved, depending on what kind of diet that organism has evolved for. So humans are omnivores. We have lots of different kinds of teeth, whereas carnivores, like this lion, have teeth mostly dedicated just to meat eating, and pure herbivores have teeth dedicated just to eating plants. What about birds? They don't have teeth. What do they do? Well, we'll have to think about that. But after we chew up our food, we swallow it, right? Birds, they swallow their food whole typically, and it comes down and gets kind of partially digested in the stomach, and then it hits the gizzard, which is a muscular organ, often with rocks inside, that contracts and pushes and chews the food for the bird after it's swallowed, which is kind of weird. All right, so we swallow our food. What does that look like? Well, when you swallow your food, you use your tongue and your throat muscles to push it back and down, and it goes into through the pharynx into the esophagus, and hopefully it does not go into your trachea, your windpipe. And we have actually a little flap of skin here called the epiglottis that is like a valve, a protective valve that keeps food out of the windpipe. That chewed up food now is called a bolus. A bolus, it's mixed up with saliva, and it's swallowed. And then what happens is the muscles in your esophagus rhythmically contract. This part, then this part, then this part, then this part, all the way down, pushing that bolus of food down towards the stomach. That contraction is known as peristalsis. You can see the word peristaltic here. Peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction. It's an involuntary muscle contraction. Pushes that food down towards the stomach. Kind of like squeezing a packet of ketchup onto French fries. You start at the back and you push to the front. Your muscle contracts all the way down, pushing that food down towards your stomach. Okay? So now the food has reached the stomach, and that's where we'll pick up in our next video.